Hey everyone, hope you're well. Just want to do some background here for Soviet Montage. We should be watching Battleship Potemkin for next week. Here's a little timeline to give you a sense of where this is coming from, right? Soviet Montage emerges out of revolution against the Tsar. In general, almost everybody was uniformly unhappy with the czarist regime that exists, not just not just communists and socialists, but middle class people, etc. It was a very oppressive regime and just out of touch with the times and out of touch with the people. In February 1917, there's sort of a middle class uprising that occurs against the Tsar and establishes this provisional government at that time. By October 1917, the Bolsheviks, which is like what Lenin's tied to, um, overthrows the provisional government. And then for the subsequent 3 years, there's a war, internal civil war between these different factions. There's different factions of the Reds. So there's internal bickering sort of there. There's internal factions in the Whites, which are the anti-communists. And then there's factions between them both. Many of the older filmmakers flee the country out of fear. One of the most notable things that occurs at this time is the establishment of the first film school ever in the world. 1919, the Soviets established VGK, where some of the most famous directors, like Sergei Eisenstein, whose film you're going to watch for this week, was teaching while creating films itself. Some of you might have heard of this guy, Lev Kuleshov. He creates this workshop, during the revolution. In many ways, some of the most famous directors study under him. Vladislav Potovkin and Sergei Eisenstein are some of the students. And Kuleshov, because they're lacking film in the Soviet Union at this time, they use films that they already have. And one they use is D.W. Griffith's Intolerance. It comes out shortly after Birth of a Nation. And they recut up the film and kind of figure out how he operates, you know, um, through montage, how the film functions. One famous thing you might have heard of is the Kuleshov effect. So I'm just going to pull it up here briefly to show you. So it's this notion that you can kind of have the same pictures, but through montage, right? Kuleshov really propounds the notion of montage is the key to cinema. So how you arrange the different sequences of the celluloid will change the way in which the picture does. So he rearranges these um, pictures to kind of give a different kind of meaning each time. So you'll see here, bowl of soup, cut to person's face, right? Which that one effect, right, might lead to bowl of soup by itself, person's face, hunger or desire for it. Kuleshov effect 2, child in a coffin, person's face, right? And the point is that you would project as an audience member onto this actor as a result of what it's cut to. So the meaning between the actor's face and the bowl of soup would be something different than the actor's face and, the coffin, which might be sadness suddenly you're getting a sense of. And just a more complicated cut here. So Kuleshov sort of experimented with that stuff at the time of rearranging, montage and seeing how it operated and worked. The key thing is, I know montage literally translates into editing, but it's more than that for the Soviets, right? It's this overall structuring principle of the film. It's a way of not just editing, but of thinking the film as a totality, of understanding all its relationships in relation to one another. It's a very modernist experimentation that sort of, in many ways, is related to some of the earlier stuff we saw. We saw German Expressionism, which was a different way of sort of conceptualizing cinema. Last week we talked about the avant-garde, right, and sort of the ways in which they were sort of the filmmakers that were trying to offer new ways and new forms to understand the world. Similarly, Soviet montage is also building off of these ways of redoing stuff.
This is the checkers game where grandson.
Sorry, I had something come up there. Just pop technologies. So, we can think of Soviet montage as sort of, again, trying to create a new art form to understand this world that seems out of order with all this upheaval going on within it. How can they restructure the world to understand it again and see themselves as active participants within it? It's a good line here. To make the world anew, one must see it differently. It's not just putting new ideas in old forms, but actually reconceptualizing what cinema itself is. And I have you reading two pieces by Sergei Eisenstein that give you a sense of how he's reconceptualizing the cinema. He's an interesting character. Uh, Only lives to about 50. This is interesting. Prior to the revolution, he planned on being an engineer and architect. Once the revolution happens, his parents flee, and Eisenstein drops out of college and joins the Red Army as an engineer, which he was studying to be. But as he gets involved with that, he starts getting involved with art. He becomes a poster artist on these Agit trains, these trains that would go across the Soviet Union to display the revolution going on, because far off places, people wouldn't even know that the revolution was happening. So the trains would go out and spread the word that it was happening. He eventually joins Moscow's Prolakul Theater, which he talks about in one of the pieces I have you read, where he starts directing plays and integrating cinema shorts into them. His first film is called Strike, done in collaboration with the Prolakul Theater. There's a couple core concepts here, typage, which you'll read about, and this is quoting Eisenstein about Potemkin. He goes, "There are no actors in the film. There are only real people in the film, and it was the director's job to find the right people. It was physical appearances rather than proven artistic abilities that were decisive." He also wants to conceptualize the masses hero, not focusing on individual people, but understanding a collective as a whole. Not that he doesn't kind of focus in on certain people at times within the film, but then he pulls out so it doesn't become they're just their stories. There's a dialectical push and pull between individual stories and the mass as hero. This is another quote from Eisenstein saying, "We must direct all our resources toward ensuring that art always exacerbates a current conflict rather than distracting audiences from it. Art is not about, for him, mindless entertainment to take away from the troubles of the world, but actually direct our attention to those issues and really engaging us with them." He doesn't see montage as something one thing that happens after the other, but sees it simultaneously, as if these pieces are interacting one on top of another. So montage can happen where a later sequence might help you re-understand an earlier sequence itself in the film. It just doesn't operate from the beginning to the end, but the end starts re-inflecting the way we understand the beginning. There's a series of types of montage, which I'm not going to go over here, and David Cook talks about them, and I have part of your discussion board addressing them. So I'd like you to do that, and then I'll comment back on your discussion board post. With Potemkin, it's done or made during the 20th anniversary of this failed revolution, the 1905 revolution. It was only originally supposed to be one section of a larger film, but Eisenstein came to the realization that it needed to be its own film itself. This again is Eisenstein's conceptualization. It's a very anti-romantic understanding of filmmaking. He considers filmmaking purely mathematical affair, and it has nothing to do with the manifestation of creative genius. He really rejects that notion. Potemkin becomes a huge film internationally, massive word of mouth abroad. A score is created by a German Marxist who's so inspired by it. Einstein gets critiqued because of the film's pathos, its emotionality. He explains in one of the pieces I have you read, "People must learn to hold their heads high and feel their humanity. They must be human, become human. The intention of the film is no more, no less." It's a good question. How does the film do this? Express its kind of humanity. And a couple other things to think of while watching it. Now, how does the film employ different types of montage listed above that David Cook talks about as well? And then finally, how is the individual balanced with the mass as hero? So I look forward to seeing what you're writing on the discussion board post, and I'll comment back when we're done. Thanks. Stay safe.